You're well away, right?
That's cool.
All right. Well, no, I just wanted to know because I wasn't clear. What I was more interested in was if you've done that, because weirdly I've seen a couple of people. I saw yours, Alice, for example, right? And it would be handy then, like, like people who'd already approached me about things actually came to me because you already know what people are doing. You know, that would make sense for me. I don't know what the system is.
I think it's very confusing for everyone because it's like don't really know how this works.
Yeah,
It's literally based on the form and then what you handed in for your assignment.
Okay.
Based on what you handed in, they're going to put you with, if they can include you on the form, who they think would fit best for you.
Yeah, and that obviously makes a lot of sense. And, you know, and that's the ideal way of doing things. But I wish we were in the loop a little earlier. You know, that would be really helpful. It would have been helpful to be in the loop before this first assignment was done, so you can actually advise people on the form of it and what kind of things go into it. And so I just think that it would starting a bit earlier would be better, you know, with that kind of thing. Because how much was this one worth? 10%, 15%? 15. Even 15% is significant.
Yeah.
You know, so yeah, you want to have a good mark for that 15% because you don't want to be chasing it for the other parts of it.
That's the trickiest part. They told us it was going to be.
I think it's probably the most, I don't want to say the most difficult, but it's the part that can be done wrong most easily.
Yeah.
I've mangled my words a bit, but I think you know what I mean. Okay, now, when we talk about the culture of the games industry, one of the most important exemplifications of it is an incident, or a series of, actually, it's a series of incidents rather than an incident, which occurred nearly 10 years ago now, but is still incredibly important. If you talk about this with Will Merrin, for example, Will argue that Gamergate is the single most important cultural event that's happened in the 21st century. Because the model for right-wing extremism in contemporary Western culture was set in the Gamergate scandal of 2014. That is how online communities could create a false sense of outrage about an invented sort of incident that then propelled all sorts of behaviour amongst people who were not involved in the incident whatsoever, and actually displayed toxic traits of culture which become normalised in terms of how people perceive and see different acts in society. So for Will, and I agree with him on this point as well, if we look at Gamergate, it provides a template of how sort of right-wing outrage becomes a normalised part of Western culture, Western society. I'm going to talk a lot about Gamergate in week 9, so I'm not going to talk about it a huge amount here. But when we think of the industry itself and how it pictures gamers, Gamergate starts to make a lot of sense. So when you think about what actually happened in Gamergate, Gamergate became basically a hashtag across social media in around August and September 2014. So a lot of people started getting tagged with the hashtag Gamergate. That social media behaviour was a direct targeting of actually quite a number of people, but the 3 most prominent people who were targeted during Gamergate were Zoe Quinn, Brianna Wu, and Anita Sarkeesian. 3 women, all involved in the games industry. Zoe Quinn, game designer, Brianna Wu, journalist / cultural commentator, Anita Sarkeesian, game designer and commentator, and owner of a very important and prominent YouTube channel called Feminist Frequency, which is still running now. Fair play to her. How the hell she stuck with it, I don't know, but it's still running now, and it's still got lots and lots of interesting content on it. And if you haven't checked out Feminist Frequency, I do suggest you do, because there's loads of interesting stuff about the games industry and games in general on it as well. So the nuts and bolts of this is that Iron Gioni, Quinn's ex-boyfriend, alleged an unethical relationship between Zoe Quinn and Nathan Grayson, who was a video game journalist and reporter, around Quinn's game, which was released in December 2012, called Depression Quest. So Zoe Quinn, an indie game designer, released a indie game called Depression Quest in December 2012. Now, with the best will in the world, I don't want to be horrible here, Depression Quest isn't a very good game. But I actually think that's kind of the point of the game as well. She's making a meta point about depression in it. It's slow, it's difficult to do, and I think embedded in that is a meta point of what it feels like to be depressed and try to do things, that everything becomes slow and really difficult to do. So I actually think it's quite clever in itself. One thing I would say, it's not much fun to play, but again, I kind of think that's Zoe Quinn's point that she's making in the game. And games themselves can have these ideas embedded in them. You know, and as we saw last week when I was talking about procedural rhetoric with Ian Bogost, what Quinn has decided to do here is make a game which is actually deliberately slow and hard to play to mimic what she feels are some of the key characteristics of depression and how we do things when we're depressed. Anyway, the game was actually fairly well received, I think, and I think most people got the point of the game itself. Quinn had a number, it is alleged, of relationships outside of the relationship with her boyfriend. It is alleged. I believe, like, there's probably evidence to suggest that there was one that was going on. Okay, so basically what you have here is an ex-boyfriend who is pissed off because his girlfriend cheated on him. Well, boo-hoo-hoo. That shit happens all the time. You know, he's not the first person to have that happen. Won't be the last. Get over it. That's what the rest of us do. However, Joni didn't get over it. Well, at least I guess he had a big pardon shot. In a number of blog posts that he did on his own blog, he accused Quinn of having a relationship with a game journalist, and that was the relationship she was having when she was cheating on him. And that she did this directly to get good reviews of her game. Therefore, not just casting Quinn in a particular light, although there's a very clear indication that he is trying to do that here, but also putting the games journalism industry in a particular light, is that games journalists will give anything a good review if you sleep with them. This is a big problem, apparently. At this point, a couple of things need to be made clear. She had no relationship with Nathan Grayson whatsoever. Nothing like that existed. And moreover, Grayson never really reviewed the game. Didn't actually publish a review of that game at all. He had nothing to do with it. There's no indication that he even played it. So, basically that entire post was a load of bullshit. The post got picked up on, though, by members of particular online communities. In particular, 4chan was the one that became really problematic, but also it sprung up on a number of different Reddits as well. So, from his delivery of these accusations in early summer 2014 to increased traction through August and September, you start to see more and more posts on boards like 4chan and 8chan about this apparent Gamergate. The idea that the video games journalism industry is corrupt and that they are only reviewing these kind of games, games like Depression Quest, which, what are these kind of games? Made by women, made outside the major game studio system, not AAA, not targeted towards male, white, affluent, heterosexual players, that these games are being reviewed favourably because the women that make them are sluts. Now, that sounds awful. That's basically the fucking argument, in a whole. That is it in a nutshell. If you want to boil down Gamergate to a simple set of statements, that's it. As Gamergate spreads, Zoe Quinn starts to become the recipient of hundreds and then thousands and then tens of thousands of death threats and rape threats. Quinn has to go into hiding. She literally has to go into a sort of witness protection program. because people are sending things to her home. People are seen outside her home. People are yelling in the middle of the night outside. Those who stepped in to defend Zoe Quinn, like Brianna Wu and Anita Sarkeesian, get the same treatment. And other women in the games industry, even if they don't comment on this, also start to get targeted with the same treatment. It becomes a contagion, a viral contagion of women are not welcome in the games industry themselves. All women in the games industry are there for the same reason that Zoe Quinn is there, because she sleeps around. Sleeps around with prominent people in the games industry. That's the only reason why she's there. That's the reason why her games get good reviews. This is the entirety of basically the argument against people like Zoe Quinn. So, I hate those sounds. I might live or something. Oh, don't do that. Excuse me a moment while I have a word with this computer. Don't give me any shit, you bastard. So, we have something which escalates from a blog post to a full-on culture war, where the original blog post has not one element of truth in it to begin with. It is taken as fact by particular communities online who then use it to legitimize a particular set of actions about what they see as the proper ethical conduct of the games industry. For Humphreys, this legitimizes the culture of disrespect in gaming and in the industry itself. The reason why it legitimizes that is because how many of those people do you think that were involved in Gamergate and the trolling of female figures in the games industry, how many saw justice?
Zero.
Zero. Of course nobody did. Because this is all done anonymously. It is no accident this is done on anonymous message boards like 4chan, where anonymity is actually a feature of making those posts. It is no surprise that when Brianna Wu, and you know, if you want to see the fucking responses to that tweet that I've just put up as an image there. But nearly all of those responses come from user accounts on Twitter, which are like user 2746138219813, set up like 1 minute after that post was made. People in this use the anonymity afforded to them on platforms and on the internet in order to make these things happen. Again, we see that as a critical feature in the next couple of years after Gamergate. The rise of Trump, Brexit, other sort of right-wing movements across Europe, it all coalesces
It's all kind
around
of the
this.
same playbook.
Yeah, it's a playbook. It is a set of techniques in order to manufacture outrage in order to try and create a particular outcome. The outcome in this case is the eradication of women from the games industry. Because they're a threat. They're a threat to that hegemonic value of what a gamer is. What Gamergate tells us, in a very, very important way, is that image of gamer that we had at the beginning, which Ciara Chess calls player one, isn't just a construct. It has been internalized, not just by the games industry, but by the gamer culture. People who call themselves gamers identify with that. And anything which is a perceived threat to it, like women making games which have different, which you don't have to, you know, kill everyone and go and colonize something which isn't yours, and you know, the whole point of it is to barbarically ruin a culture. Games which don't do that, well, they're wrong. Oh, no, I don't feel comfortable with that. These are the sort of people who would not play Life is Strange, I can assure you. So, Gamergate is really, really interesting in this context, because it tells us that what is a gamer is now a problem on several different levels. What is a gamer is something which is culturally accepted by most people, it's culturally accepted by the industry, but also has been internalized by particular groups of people who identify with that image and will protect that image against any perceived threats to it as well. When the games industry tries to pivot, tries to bring more women into the game, tries to bring more people of colour into the game, tries to bring people with alternative sexualities into gaming, there is going to be a major fucking pushback from this group who identify themselves as gamers, as the custodians of the activity, as the people who, this is what it's for, these are the people who it's about. You people don't matter. Who's going to say something?
Sorry, gatekeepers, is that the term?
Yeah, I think gatekeepers is a very good term to use here, yeah. I think that would make a lot of sense. It's a perceived gatekeeping, but then most gatekeeping is a perceptual thing rather than an actual thing. So, people outside of that gamer identity are marginalised discursively. Gamergate is a discourse. Discourses legitimise particular ideologies that are dominant within a society. The purpose of a discourse is to legitimise a particular set of ideologies. And anyone outside of the gamer construct is marginalised through discourses. Even if this isn't numeric, because there's evidence, more than ample evidence to suggest that gaming is not made up of these people. Most gamers are not fitting into these categories. So, we have a really big cultural problem here. Now, you might expect the lead systems designer for League of Legends not to belittle his players. League of Legends, as we have already noted in a couple of different lectures, is one of these games that is closely identified with this notion of the gamer. It's probably unfair. I don't think everyone who plays League of Legends is, you know, an incel who stinks because they haven't showered for weeks and lives purely off, you know. Think of a really, you know, Monster Munch. Or some shit like that. Fucking energy drinks. Gamers aren't innately toxic. It's all about context. It's about context inside the game and outside the game and how they can twist behaviours. How they can create toxic behaviours even in good people. This is Jeffrey Lynn, who's the lead systems designer, social systems designer for League of Legends. This is taken out of Jamie Madigan's book. Now, Lynn is actually right about this. I think Lynn's point here is correct. It isn't, gamers aren't innately toxic. There isn't like an innate toxicity to people who play video games. It's about the context that video games exist in. Where he's not prepared to take any credit for this is quite interesting, because it's games like his that have both a context of playing the game, but really importantly, a parasocial and social context around the game which encourages, fosters, nurtures, and develops toxic behaviour that is the problem. If he wanted to turn this insight in on himself, he could say, as the social systems designer for League of Legends, he's a part of this big problem here, which he's actually isn't prepared to do. But I think his role is actually quite important in this. So, what Madigan asks us to do is actually go and check out websites like the Bigot Gamer and Fat, Ugly or Slutty. Please do check them out to see some of the more vile instances of what occurs in gamer culture. Despite Lynn's protestations, and I think there's some fair points made here, that doesn't really take away the idea that there is a toxic culture at play here. And that toxic culture is emergent from this idea that gaming is for me, not for them, and that those people need to be denigrated in particular ways. It's a very important function of how gaming, if you like, works. There is a psychological term to explain this kind of behaviour, and it's called de-individuation. It's a very important term in social psychology in particular. It emerges in the 1960s as a result of a number of different experiments, the most important of them, and if you've done A-level psychology, you're probably familiar with Stanley Milgram experiments in the 1960s. Milgram wanted to understand power in totalitarian regimes. In particular, he was fascinated with why seemingly normal, average, everyday people could do horrific things in the Holocaust. So Milgram devised an experiment. Does anyone know what I'm talking about with Milgram's experiment?
Was it the electric shock one?
Yeah.
Trick or,
What are you thinking?
the trick or treat one.
It's not the trick or treat one, but I know what you're thinking of, but it's a different person. So Milgram basically had as an experimental setup here. So let's imagine it in our minds. Jen, you are the experimental subject, okay? And Will is the person that we're going to experiment on. So what happens in this experiment is Milgram himself stands in like a white pose, looks like a legitimate science guy, and Jem is my subject, okay? And I'm going to say, right, I'm going to ask Will a set of questions here. Every time he gets a question wrong, you're going to give him an electric shock. Because what actually happens is that, you know, giving people electric shock focuses the mind and makes them smarter, if you like. Makes them realise there's consequences for the wrong idea and wrong answers. So, Will, you've just answered the question on Jem. Give him a shock. There we go. And on it goes. It starts at like 5 volts or something like that, you know, it's a small shock. But eventually builds up and up and up. Until you start giving him shocks. But actually, the reason why you're giving him shocks is because he can't answer. Because he can no longer answer. Because you've given him so many shocks that actually you've killed him. 63% of the participants in Milgram's study killed him. A person they'd never met before. They were doing this for $5. That was the payment for the experiment. And what Milgram found is of his participants, 20 participants that took part in the study, 13 of those people were quite happy not just to kill the other person, but to keep electrocuting the corpse afterwards because they didn't respond. You know, you said, well, they haven't answered, so that's a wrong answer. Well, they haven't answered because he's dead. But they went all the way to the top of the voltmeter. So not only had they killed the person, they actually barbecued the corpse at that point as well. Now, in variations of that research, Milgram did a number of different things. But one of the ones that was most powerful was he gave the person who was given the shocks a hood. When hooded, 100% of the participants killed the other person because they could not be identified. I mean, it's pretty disturbing anyway that 65% of people would happily kill someone for $5. That's the takeaway that we should be concentrating on. But if you remove identity, then it gets worse. So this got another social psychologist thinking about this, a guy called Philip Zimbardo. And in the 1970s, Zimbardo did a piece of research, actually paid for by the American Navy, where he recreated a prison scenario in the basement of Stanford University. It was paid for by the Navy the Navy wanted to look at how quick could it be to set up a prison-type scenario on ships in Vietnam, because they were struggling at that point, the American Army and the Navy, with housing prisoners of war in the Vietnam War. So what Zimbardo did was he recruited 24, I think it was 24, male recruits, and evenly divided them into guards and prisoners in this really makeshift sort of prison setup in the basement of the psychology department in Stanford University. He called it the Stanford Prison Experiment. What did he do? Well, he gave the prisoners the same kind of clothes to wear as one another, so you could identify them. And in particular with the guards, he gave them the same kind of clothes to wear. He also gave them mirror shades, mirror sunglasses. So there was no eye contact between guards and prisoners. Very important way of establishing a lack of personal sort of, connection with people is to deny eye contact. He had to call the experiment off after 3 days because the guards were he didn't give any instructions, just wanted to see what would happen if you just arbitrarily gave people the power to be prison guards. And after 3 days, they were torturing the prisoners.
Yeah.
People that they'd never met, students, same age as them, like 18, 19 years old. They basically started torturing them after 3 days. They strongly identified with one another, but completely denigrated these people based on a completely arbitrary decision. These weren't people who committed crimes. These weren't actual prisoners. These were students just like them who had been randomly allocated a role in this experiment. They had done nothing wrong and they didn't know anything about them. But after 3 days, they were doing things like stopping them from going to sleep, doing like sleep deprivation stuff with them. It's like, you know, fuck them, they're prisoners. It's like, they're not. This is a game, this is a joke. De-individuation. Those prison guards had been de-individuated. Aspects of their own identity had been taken off them, and in particular aspects of the prisoner's identity had been taken off them. Those guards weren't allowed to refer to the prisoners by their names, only by a number that had been given. So they had been de-individuated as well. They didn't see those people as individuals, they just saw them as this group, which had deliberately been created as having lower status than them. They were prisoners, not guards. Guards themselves couldn't behave with impunity because you couldn't identify them because it was like, you know, disguising characteristics afforded to them. They just went nuts. They literally wanted to torture these people. You know, Zimbardo was recording the conversations. They were talking about beating them up. They were talking about, should we bring in, like, you know, batons and things so we can give them a beating? Like, holy shit. Okay.
There's been a lot of trouble recreating the standard prison experiments.
Yeah, do you know
since,
why?
Because of the
Because you will end up in court.
But that's precisely it.
Yeah, you
The-
can't recreate
The lack
defeats,
of
yeah.
ethics in Zimbardo's
Yeah.
experiment and all the violations
I
of...
think Zimbardo's
makes
less
it-
ethically culpable than Milgram, who actually set out to see if people would kill other people. He just removed the actual killing from it. But he was interested to see, like, you know, how to get normal people to kill people. That would never get past ethics now. The Zimbardo prison experiment wouldn't get past ethics as well, which means it'll never be replicated because you can't actually do that. But the findings of them are less interesting than the phenomena which underpins it. This idea of de-individuation. If you strip the ability to identify a person, they will do extreme things because there are no consequences for it. That is, in essence, the psychological notion of de-individuation. A mental state where people's identity fades into the background of their thoughts so much that they become much more susceptible to cues from the environment and people around them as to how to behave. So in the Zimbardo study, these people, if you like, forgot who they were, and instead picked up cues in the environment which they then related to what they knew about being a prison guard, largely from Hollywood films, right, where prison guards are complete bastards and wail on the prisoners all the time, and enacted that.
I think one of them actually had the nickname among the prisoners of John Wayne because he would
He just swaggered about the place.
Yeah, he would emanate one of John Wayne's movie characters.
Yeah. Basically, what we have here is reduced social accountability. You can't see me, so therefore I can do these things. So, one of the issues of toxic gaming culture is this reduced social accountability. We live in a world where having zero social accountability is actually very, very easy to do. We just anonymise our presence in particular ways. There have been a number of significant discussions, particularly Microsoft have taken this on in a big way, that they're going to get rid of anonymity on the Xbox servers. And they've been talking about doing this for about 14 years now. They haven't done it. The reason why they haven't done it is that it still focus group tests really badly with people who use the servers. People on, gamers want the anonymity. They don't want to be identified. Because the minute you identify people, you have consequences for what you say and do. And that's not what some people want, So people actually kind of like this reduced sort of responsibility. Now, there is something very positive to be said for anonymity as well. Anonymity online actually has really, really positive outcomes. For example, if you live in a country where, you know, LGBTQIA plus people are persecuted, to have an anonymous identity online, to be able to express your sexuality and be able to express your needs as an individual and not be traced and not be persecuted because of that is actually a very, very important thing. However, that's not quite a defence of people who engage in Gamergate, for example.
What about, is there a correlation or causation between like increase in men crimes and violence because they basically express their, you know, negative energy and violence in the online world?
It's an interesting point. It's a point which is kind of really important in the wider context of games, because one of the important arguments for not censoring violent video games is they provide a catharsis. So, you know, if you play violent video games, it's not that you're less likely to be violent in everyday life, but it provides a psychological release which could otherwise be released in ways which are not so desirable. There's no harm in, you know, killing a load of people in Grand Theft Auto. At the end of the day, there aren't any consequences for that. It's a safe thing to do. Much better you do that than kill a load of people in a high school. You know, you know, if you want to make a comparison between the two behaviours, one is much more desirable than the other. However, it's difficult to do long-term research on the effects of this, but one thing we can say about that cultural aspect, that anonymity and being able to be misogynistic and express violent thoughts about you know, how women should be treated in the games industry, that does have consequences. Even if they're not actually realised in actual violence towards women, there are still consequences for it if you are a woman involved in those communities and in that culture. So there are still consequences. I don't want to say actually for one thing, because you know the psychological impacts of that kind of abuse could be every bit as bad as something which could happen if not in real life or physically. You know, I've never been the recipient of a rape threat. I don't want to be either, but I can imagine it's not a very nice thing. You know, and you know people saying, "Oh, we know where you live, and this is what we're going to do."
I've had friends be doxxed before.
Pardon?
I've had a couple of my friends, because I create content on Twitch in my spare time, and I know a fair few content creators, and a couple of them have been doxxed.
Okay.
And it is terrifying for them.
Yeah, I suppose it is.
Legitimately
Especially if somebody's
traumatised.
threatening you with specific things, and then they produce evidence to suggest that they know who you are IRL,
Yeah.
where you live, where you work or go to school, for example.
And
Yeah.
they could be anyone.
Absolutely. Could be somebody next door, could be somebody in Peru. You don't know. Doesn't make it any easier, right? So whereas I take the point, but I'm not sure that the argument that suggests that this is, you know, a safe way of releasing frustrations holds up, because there are actual consequences to this kind of behaviour. Basically, the idea of de-individuation relates to another psychological principle called in-group versus out-group thinking, where we are more likely to... De-individuation on its own isn't a prerequisite or a requisite of, if you are de-individuated, you're going to do nasty things. What Zimbardo showed is you also need two groups of people. You need to identify that we are these ones and those are somebody different to us. They're a threat in some way. So when you have highly delineated forms of behaviour, we can identify we're this and we're going to protect our usually dominant position, and those are the people who are threatening that. Plus, you add a dollop of de-individuation on top. It's like, we can go after them and no consequences that they can't identify us. Then you have a significant amount of problematic behaviour. So in-group versus out-group behaviour, again, there's a load of classic sort of psychological studies done on creating in-groups and out-groups. But if you add this emotional, physical arousal, which also plays a part in the de-individuation process, then you've got problems. So this is, you know, it's almost like Gamergate was a classic social psychological experiment, where you had de-individuation plus clearly decided in-groups and out-groups and so on. So, is antisocial lunatic our default setting once we feel like we're anonymous, accountable for actions and failing to inhibit our own impulses? No, it isn't. I am often in the position where I'm anonymous, unaccountable for my actions, and not particularly keen on controlling my own impulses, and yet I don't feel the need to do these things. So, the individuation in its own is not an explanation of the kind of toxic behaviour that we get in gaming communities and toxic behaviour that's associated with a gamer. That means we have to think about the culture of gaming itself and about why that culture fosters particular kinds of response. With a caveat that there are lots of people involved in gaming culture and this isn't a universal. It's not as if there are billions of people out there, because there are billions of gamers all hating on women. That's not how it works. So we do need to understand, but what we can understand about it is that the industry itself has provided us with a very clear template of what a gamer is. That has been internalised, not just by wider culture, but also by gamers themselves, and perceived threats to that, if you like, dominant position or exalted position within the culture of gaming will be slapped down very, very hard, because gaming is a de-individuated practice very often and has a very clear in-group, out-group strategy to it. So therefore, when you look at the case of Anita Sarkeesian, she's the classic outsider. Anita Sarkeesian, who was, I'd say, called up in Gamergate rather than being one of the targets of it, had been posting videos since the late 2000s, 2007, 2008. Big sort of following on YouTube for Feminist Frequency, her series of work, the sort of the umbrella term which she sort of calls her work under. Among the videos she went on to produce, these are really interesting things which people might want to pick up on projects. One, critiquing game designers' over-reliance on a damsel in distress as a plot device, J. The limitation comes with the Miss Male character trope, which I was talking about last week. Ms. Male. So I was talking about it in the context of Lara Croft and Far Cry 6, the idea that a female character actually, it's just a man with a bow on it. It's the classic Pac-Man versus Miss Pac-Man. And what's the difference between the two? Miss Pac-Man has a bow on her. She's Pac-Man. It's, it's exactly the same thing. And the misuse of women as background decorations in the scene. So, Sarkeesian isn't like some rando on fucking TikTok just making points. She does actual research. She puts a lot of time and effort into the videos that she makes, in terms not of just of how they're made, but the context and content of them as well. Talks about a lot of different games, talks about the historical trajectory of it, and talks about important ideas in sociology and psychology within those as well. Classic criticisms of the video game industry, articulated by a woman of colour. Well, what do you think is going to happen? Yeah. Each new entry in the Tropes versus Women in Video Games project elicited waves of dismissal, anger, hate, and even actual threats of violence against Anita Sarkeesian herself. People told Sarkeesian to shut up, die in a house fire, and keep her gender politics out of games. How dare gender politics be part of games? How dare politics be part of games, right? It's less than my politics. And those were just the things which were nice. And on a sliding scale, that was the decent stuff. Die in a house fire. At least it didn't say, like, that they were going to kill her. It was a secondary event that was going to do it. Most of the other things at her, there was very specific and graphics and things about how that person was going to kill her. August 2014, at the height of Gamergate, Sarkeesian felt compelled to leave her house after there were very specific, credible death threats against her, naming house, time, who was going to be there at the time, etc. This game existed. somebody, in order to sort of enact their feelings about Sarkeesian, made a game where you could beat her to a pulp and take out your frustrations. In October 2014, she was invited to deliver a lecture at Utah State University to their games department at Utah State, and there was not just a bomb threat, somebody had sent through the materials. You say, you don't think I'm serious about this, this is the stuff I have been using to make a bomb to blow up at that event. And then they took it really seriously, because it's like, yeah, you can't make a bomb out of this stuff. One way or another, I'm going to make sure they die. Okay, so, I think this is all taken a dark turn, and it is dark because the games industry is quite dark, actually. When we think about it in these terms, what is a gamer and what isn't a gamer, this is dark stuff. It is basically saying, at this point, we are gamers, the industry says we're gamers, the industry has said this is how it is and it's our thing, and all the rest of you, you can either shut up and take it, but the minute you don't, you stop being shut up, we're going to come for you. There are billions of gamers around the world, but toxic culture does definitely exist. This study is amazing. Still, 10 years after it was published, it's one of, it's kind of, I remember reading it first time and laughing, thinking, wow, this can't be real. But it is absolutely real. If you look at their research, it's so solid. In-voice chatter using a female voice earned Xbox Live players 3 times as much verbal abuse as using a male voice. Just by what they did, they varied the phrase that people said, but did it in a man's voice or a woman's voice, and the abuse was not just 3 times as frequent, but it was also much, much worse. It went from, you know, shut up, you twat, to like, I am going to fucking kill you. in that space of time as well. You think, oh, damn, okay, this is real. Well, a couple of years ago, I don't think she let me share it last year if you did MS232 with me, but Chesto is also doing an MRes like Lucy. She did her social media project on Xbox Live, and she recorded stuff when she, was she playing Overwatch or something? And she just recorded what people said to her for like an hour, and she gave me this fucking audio file, and I listened to it, and I was like, okay, there's just too much of this for a 15-minute video, but what should we do with it? But it was like, oh, I've never heard anything. It was like, I stopped counting after about 10 rape threats, and that was like 4 minutes into it. Honest to fuck, it was like 4 minutes worth, and it was like already. It was like,
that's like more than 2 per minute.
yeah, it was like 2 in the first 20 seconds. Fucking hell, I couldn't believe it. Because I'm not the recipient of this. It's actually easy for me to suggest, really, that, yeah, this problem is a thing. I don't understand this problem. I really don't, because I don't get it. It doesn't happen to me. This is a really, really important conceptual gap here. I can talk about this problem, I can present you evidence and theory about it, about why it happens, and this is the evidence that it does happen. I have no experience of this whatsoever. I'm a male game player. I am player 1. I probably should be perpetrating it, although my abuse is usually directed towards male children on FIFA. You know, and I mean, it is extreme what I say to these children, but you know, at the same time, I make sure if it's a woman I'm playing against, I don't say it. Okay, I've got some standards. Kids, I don't give a fuck about. You know, women, I just stop. Now, what we should note is that gamers don't just play games; they also make them as well. When we look at the cultural impact of gamers and the toxicity of it, what we should also take into account is that gamers are involved in the production of games. I'm not just talking about beta testing stuff here, I'm also talking about platforms like Roblox, which are user-generated. Even stuff like Minecraft, you think, Minecraft's relatively nice, that's not a bad game. I'm not too convinced about that point. I think there's lots of toxic behaviour on Minecraft as well, and lots of toxic stuff goes on it as well. When we think further about what's happening in the games industry at the moment, if you take esports, for example, it's a doubling down. If you look at behaviour around esports and esports players in particular, you take the gamer model and make it professional. Yeah? You make that into something which you can now earn a living with and earn money with. Sorry for bothering. Sorry. Hello, Richard. Like, this is brilliant. I've got to do that more. I just got to walk in places and pick up shit. It's been awesome. Esports, major industry, right? In terms of revenues, incredibly important. I have been roped into some nonsense in the university about, we've got to start an esports degree. I don't know why. Because esports is really big. Yeah. Porn's really big. Why haven't we got a degree for that? You know? And it's like, no, we can't have that. We want that instead. And it's like, well, actually, it's just as fucking toxic. So you tread carefully. So it's been around for a long time. Esports actually. First competitive video game competition in the United States was 1981. I remember, like in the 90s, it being a huge thing on television shows like Games Master, where you actually had competitive gaming displays going on. It's becoming more and more apparent in society how big esports is, and we've got an esports. Anyone in the esports society in Swansea University? No, there's 600 members apparently.
600.
Yeah, it's the biggest society.
I didn't even know
But
that.
unless you include the athletic union as a whole, that would be slightly bigger. It's not actually that much bigger, but yeah, it's actually the biggest society. It's got 600 members. I was like, whoa, that's scary and interesting at the same time. The reason why I think it's scary is because I think esports is a professionalisation of that idea of the gamer. It's taking that culturally created and defined notion from the industry and making it something which you can earn money from. And the minute you start committing the amount of time to earn money from it, you really fucking believe in it. And this is, then something we can trace, that competitive thing. Now, Will, you're a Twitcher, right? But any other Twitch channelists in here? Probably aren't, so people don't want to mention it, I suspect. Certainly esports is linked to this sort of cam culture in a big way. The idea of competitive play and display of play as being excellent in some way, as being accomplished in that sense. So how does that culture perpetrate more and more? We see new technologies and new modes of gaming and new modes of showing gaming as being enrolled in the same kind of cultural forms as gaming has always been. So that notion of the gamer, that notion of exclusion, that notion of in-group, out-group, or player one and player two gets re-perpetrated over and over again. And yeah, there's lots of contextual stuff on Twitch that suggests, female gamers are taken seriously on it. But again, if you were to ask the average person who might well play games, what the two types of people that you get on Twitch, you get like serious gamers and ethos. On flippant remark, right? That's what they'd say. Straight up, that's the two categories of people that you talk about on Twitch. So that notion of what a gamer is, it doesn't become less problematic the more technology we pour on it, the more social networking we do on it, the more affordances we give to people to change the notion of it. It actually seems to be becoming more of a thing rather than less of a thing. So I'm not going to talk much about this because it just fucking depresses me. When we blur the boundaries between games, social media, face-to-face communications and so on, you might think that that blurring is going to reduce the toxicity. Actually, It doesn't, if anything, it's amplifying the toxicity. Just go and ask a female Twitch player about toxic stuff that goes on. They'll tell you all about it. But it's increasingly becoming more central to games culture itself, this kind of public display of games, and games actually being a form of entertainment that we experience rather than play ourselves. But it is still imbibed with a kind of toxic environment, which at its root comes back to how the industry classifies what a gamer is and what a gamer isn't. Okay. What do we know? We know gamers are actually complex. Culture is important, and the one thing I want to say more than anything, context is important. The context in which how games are played is not just you sit down in front of a console, turn it on, pick up your controller, and that's it. Actually, the context of gaming is far wider, it's far more culturally defined, it's far more problematic because of that. The industry is slowly changing. Really slow. Incredibly slow. But gaming is cultural, performative, and part of identity. There are considerable differences between gamers. You wouldn't know that from the industry, and you certainly wouldn't know it by how the industry is, to borrow Curiosity's term, how it's gate-kept by people and how it's protected by certain people, and how still outsiders and people who are different are treated, not just in games and the games industry, but by wider culture as well. Alrighty. See you all next week. I looked up Kyriakos. I looked up Femcell.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like,
It comes from that kind of toxic community right about it, but yeah.
yeah. But there was a big difference. Femcells are not
I don't even know what definition is.
female celibate, but it's voluntary, not involuntary. So I couldn't find one instance of anything that talks about involuntary female celibacy.
Surely a female could be an incel.
I don't know why I felt the need to talk about that, but I have done my research on it.
Yeah. But it's because they hate women, that's why it's like classical. It's men. You know, self-loathing incel could be a female, I guess.
So I just wait for you in your